Beneath the blazing Egyptian sun, millions of limestone blocks shimmer like gold. The Great Pyramid of Giza, a monument so vast, so precise, that it seems to defy human logic. But what if its true secret wasn't in the stone, but in the system that paid for it? Because the pyramids weren't just built with muscle and faith. They were built with money. A kind of money the modern world has long forgotten. 4,000 years before Wall Street, before the dollar, before the first minted coin, the pharaohs had already mastered the most powerful economic illusion in history. They found a way to turn belief into capital and obedience into wealth. Every brick, every laborer, every field of wheat that fed the workers, it all flowed through a financial machine hidden behind temples and sacred rituals. A system where grain was currency, time was tax, and salvation was credit. It was the original pyramid scheme. Only this one built an actual pyramid. Pharaoh didn't need to conquer the world to grow richer. He only needed his people to believe. Believe that their debt to the gods could be paid through work, that their offerings weren't lost, but stored in eternity. In truth, the pyramids were more than tombs. They were vaults, balance sheets carved in stone. Proof that even in the dawn of civilization, power wasn't measured in armies or land, but in control over value itself. And this was the financial trick that built the Egyptian pyramids. A secret that still echoes through every empire since. Because money didn't just build civilization, it became it. Long before coins clinked in the hands of merchants, before ledgers tracked profits and losses, there was Egypt, the world's first grand experiment in organized wealth. It stretched along the Nile like a ribbon of green life through endless desert. Each year the river flooded, and when the waters withdrew, they left behind black, fertile soil, a gift from the gods. But this gift required management. The crops had to be counted, stored, and distributed. And so, from the rhythm of the river, Egypt built its economy. The people worshipped Pharaoh as a living god, the embodiment of divine order. But what kept that order alive wasn't only faith, it was finance. Pharaoh's power depended on his ability to collect, control, and redistribute resources on a scale the world had never seen. There were no coins, no markets filled with traders shouting prices. Instead, there was grain, measured, recorded, and stored in vast state granaries. Grain was life. Grain was money. It paid the soldiers, fed the workers, and bought the loyalty of entire provinces. In a world without metal currency, wealth was a matter of trust. Trust in the temple's storage, in the scribe's record, in the god-king's promise that your offering would not be forgotten. And that trust, more than gold or silver, fueled Egypt's rise. When we imagine the pyramids, we see slaves dragging stones under the whip of overseers. But that image is only half true. The reality was far more complex and far more ingenious. The workers were not simply forced. They were compensated, not with coins, but with food, shelter, and spiritual assurance. Their labor was a tax, their devotion an investment. Pharaoh had created something unprecedented, an economy powered not by profit, but by purpose. Every block of stone lifted toward the sky was also a transaction, a transfer of energy, faith, and obligation between ruler and ruled. Egypt had discovered the invisible architecture of wealth, the ability to turn belief into productivity. Behind every monument, behind every ceremony, there was a balance between divine will and human labor, between the promise of eternity and the reality of the Nile's next flood. And so, the pyramids rose, not as mere tombs, but as financial statements written in stone. They declared to the world that Egypt had mastered something timeless, the art of converting faith into economic force. It was a civilization built on a simple but devastating truth, that money doesn't need to exist physically, so long as people believe it does. And that belief, once harnessed, could move mountains, or in this case, build them. To understand how the pyramids were truly built, we must step inside the invisible machine that powered Egypt, the oldest functioning economy on Earth. Imagine a world without money, no coins, no paper, no ledgers, only harvests, hands, and hope. In this world, grain was everything. It was food, it was tax, it was savings, It was the heartbeat of civilization. Each year, when the Nile flooded, the state collected a portion of every farmer's yield, not as punishment, but as participation in the divine order. This was called the labor tax, a sacred duty owed to Pharaoh, the earthly voice of the gods. Grain poured into storage complexes that stretched for miles, massive silos beside temples, guarded by priests and scribes. There, every kernel was measured, recorded, and accounted for. Clay tablets served as receipts, proof that one's debt to the state, or to the gods, was fulfilled. Those tiny marks in clay were Egypt's first financial records, its invisible currency system. But there was something deeper at play. The pharaoh didn't just collect grain, he redistributed it. He used it to pay workers, fund construction, and feed the armies that defended Egypt's borders. The people's offerings came back to them as wages, sustenance, and security. The system was circular, elegant, efficient, and self-sustaining. And within that circle lay the genius of the pharaohs. They didn't need gold to build their empire, they had belief. The people believed in divine reciprocity, that what they gave to the gods would return as blessings, rain, and harvest. It was an economy not of coins, but of faith-based accounting. Every temple was a treasury, every offering, a transaction, every priest, a manager of divine assets. Egypt had unknowingly built the prototype for every centralized financial system that would follow. When a farmer brought his grain to the temple, it wasn't charity. It was deposit. When he served his days in labor, it wasn't punishment. It was payment of tax. And when the pharaoh decreed new construction, he wasn't merely commanding obedience. He was initiating an economic stimulus. This was the system behind the stones, a cycle of production, taxation, and redistribution, all powered by the people's faith in the divine order. It was flawless, it was profitable, and it was built on illusion. An illusion that the gods themselves had written the rules. The same illusion that still sustains economies today. At the heart of ancient Egypt's power lay not just a system, but a trick. A financial illusion so profound that it turned faith into currency and worship into labor. The trick was simple, and yet almost invisible. Pharaohs convinced millions that service to the gods was not just holy, it was an investment in eternity itself. In this belief, Egypt found a way to mobilize an entire civilization, without rebellion, without coin, and without collapse. When the floodwaters of the Nile receded, farmers faced months of idle time. Their fields lay resting, but their hands did not. The pharaoh's administrators arrived with decrees. The gods require labor. The temples require builders. Pharaoh requires your devotion. And the people obeyed. But what looked like obedience was, in truth, economic participation. Each laborer received rations, bread, beer, and shelter, all drawn from the grain stored in the royal granaries. Those rations were not gifts, they were payments, drawn against the spiritual credit the worker had earned through service. This was the divine debt, a sacred obligation to the gods, paid in time and sweat. In return, Pharaoh's treasuries would provide sustenance, forgiveness, and favor. That cycle, work, debt, devotion, reward, was the invisible engine that built the pyramids. No coins exchanged hands, no markets crashed, no inflation, only faith, perfectly managed, perfectly monetized. Every offering, every hour of labor, was logged by scribes who served as Egypt's first accountants. In their scrolls, belief was quantified, holiness became arithmetic. And through this record-keeping, Pharaoh maintained control not just of wealth, but of time itself. Because to owe the gods was to owe the pharaoh, and the pharaoh never forgot a debt. People worked not because they were forced, but because they believed their labor purchased a kind of immortality. To work on Pharaoh's tomb was to earn favor in the afterlife, to become, in a sense, spiritually wealthy. But behind the incense and prayers was a precise machine of economic calculation. Each worker's ration of grain was measured by scribes who recorded every loaf and jug, a proto-payroll system, millennia before Excel. Temples issued tokens or written acknowledgments that could be redeemed for food, lodging, or even debt forgiveness. To the eyes of the modern economist, it was genius. Pharaoh had invented a closed economy, where production, distribution, and consumption all cycled through his divine authority. The people believed they were serving heaven. In truth, they were fueling the state. This was the financial trick. Pharaoh turned faith into leverage, labor into liquidity, and belief into capital. Through the temples, the economy of Egypt became one of controlled scarcity. Only Pharaoh could release the grain, forgive the debt, or declare a season of abundance. The people's survival depended not just on their crops, but on the Pharaoh's favor. Control the faith, control the food, control the food, control the people. And so, the Pharaohs ruled not by sword, but by scarcity. The genius of Egypt's system was the scale of its pyramids. It was the scale of its illusion of abundance. The people believed the gods provided all things, but only through Pharaoh's hands. That belief ensured loyalty, stability, and endless labor. It's why the pyramids are still standing. They weren't financed by gold. They were financed by conviction. Imagine an entire civilization unified by one shared credit system, the afterlife. To work was to deposit, to serve was to invest, to obey was to accrue eternal interest. And in that divine economy, the Pharaoh was both banker and god. Every offering to the temple strengthened his treasury. Every prayer reinforced his power. Each time a farmer tithed a portion of grain, it was stored in the massive silos that lined the Nile, symbols of both divine provision and royal control. In time, this belief-based economy would outlast its builders. Long after the workers had died, long after their debts were paid in stone and sweat, the monuments remained. Monuments not only to Pharaoh's glory, but to the ultimate truth of money. That value exists only where belief sustains it. The pyramids were, in essence, the world's first great balance sheets. Vast, immovable ledgers recording the exchange between gods and men. Every block was an entry, every inscription, an accounting, every pyramid, a profit report in limestone. Egypt's trick wasn't building big, it was building belief. A system so timeless that it echoes in every civilization that came after. The pyramid was only the surface. Beneath it, hidden behind chants, incense, and ritual, was the machine that kept Egypt's divine economy running. The temple. The temples of ancient Egypt weren't just places of worship. They were financial institutions, the central banks of the ancient world. Behind every god's image stood a complex bureaucracy, scribes, priests, treasurers, and administrators, all keeping the machinery of belief in motion. When farmers brought their offerings of grain, oil, or cattle, the temple recorded each deposit meticulously. These offerings were stored, redistributed, or lent out. Not in the language of interest, but in the language of righteousness. The temple decided who received resources, which projects were funded, and which debts could be forgiven. The priests were not just spiritual guides, they were economic architects. They managed supply chains, workforce logistics, and resource allocation with mathematical precision. The hymns and prayers concealed what was essentially a financial operation, an empire run by faith-backed accounting. Scribes sat in long, echoing halls filled with papyrus scrolls. They documented every measure of grain, every laborer's ration, every delivery to a construction site. Their writing was sacred, because to record value was to preserve divine order. The act of accounting itself was a holy ritual. And at the top of this structure stood Pharaoh. Not as a distant monarch, but as the CEO of divinity. Every temple ultimately answered to him. Every ledger led back to the throne. Temples owned land, employed thousands, and held the wealth of entire regions. Their storerooms overflowed with offerings. Their scribes wielded more influence than generals. Their decisions could starve or feed entire provinces. The system was breathtakingly efficient and terrifyingly absolute. To question the temple's authority was to question the gods. To disobey Pharaoh's decrees was to disrupt the sacred balance of Ma'at, the divine order that kept the universe itself from collapsing. Through this union of theology and economics, Egypt achieved what no other civilization had before: complete synchronization of faith and finance. The people didn't just believe in their religion. They lived inside it. Every transaction, every meal, every prayer was part of the same cosmic ledger. The result? A society that functioned like a living organism, self-sustaining, obedient, and profoundly stable. But stability always comes with a cost. And for Egypt, that cost was buried not in gold, but in the lives of those who sustained the illusion. Every empire built on belief hides its casualties in silence, and Egypt, for all its brilliance, order, and faith, was no exception. For the system to thrive, someone had to pay. Not with coins, but with life itself. The farmers along the Nile gave the first share of their harvest to the state. Their best grain, their strongest cattle. What remained was barely enough to survive until the next flood. When drought came, the temples opened their granaries only for those still loyal, those still obedient. In the shadow of the pyramids, hunger became a form of taxation. The workers who built Pharaoh's monuments lived in state-run camps, well-fed during construction, forgotten when their usefulness ended. They labored in blinding heat, hauling stone after stone, believing their toil would echo in eternity. But most died without ever seeing the monument completed. Their names erased, their credit to the gods absorbed into Pharaoh's eternal account. This was the unseen cost of faith-driven finance. A civilization built on spiritual debt, where salvation was promised, but never paid out. The scribes, though literate and revered, were bound too. Their pens enforced the system that trapped their own families. Their job was to ensure that no one escaped their divine obligation. Not a farmer, not a fisherman, not a widow selling grain by the river. And so Egypt prospered while its people endured. The pyramids rose higher as the living sank deeper into invisible servitude. They didn't see themselves as poor. They saw themselves as pious. That was the genius of Pharaoh's system. The poor didn't rebel, because they believed they were part of something eternal. The temples, magnificent and unyielding, became fortresses of inequality. The gods grew richer as the peasants grew weary. The economy thrived on faith, and faith could never be questioned. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Crops failed. Floods grew unpredictable. Provinces whispered of corruption. Priests hoarding grain, scribes altering records. The divine order began to tilt. When belief sustains power, doubt is the greatest threat. And when doubt enters the heart of a believer, the illusion collapses. In time, Egypt would fracture. Its faith weakened, its temples raided, its ledgers burned. But the idea, the trick, would survive. Because the world had learned something from the sands of the Nile. That people will work, sacrifice, and even suffer. Not for gold, but for meaning. And when meaning becomes currency, control becomes absolute. The world has changed. The gods have new names. But the trick remains the same. Today, we no longer kneel before pharaohs. We kneel before systems, invisible empires made of algorithms, banks, and governments. Our temples are made of glass and steel. Our priests wear suits. Our offerings are digital. But at its core, the modern economy runs on the same illusion that built the pyramids. Belief as value. The dollar, the euro, the yen. None of it is backed by gold. It's backed by trust. Paper promises, born from confidence in the state. The new gods of civilization. When you work for your paycheck, when you deposit your savings, when you pay your taxes, you are engaging in the same sacred exchange that once took place between Egyptian farmers and Pharaoh. You labor, you give, you trust, and you hope the system rewards you. Our central banks function like the temples of old. They control scarcity and abundance, interest and debt. They regulate the flow of money like the Nile. Too much, and there's chaos. Too little, and there's famine. And just like the priests of Egypt, modern bankers speak in mysteries few can interpret. Equations instead of hieroglyphs, policies instead of prayers. Debt is our divine obligation now. We are born into it, we live within it, and we die before paying it off. Taxes, loans, mortgages, modern echoes of Egypt's sacred labor tax. We are still told it's for the greater good, for the preservation of order. And just as Pharaoh once claimed divine right, governments today claim economic necessity. The language has changed, but the structure hasn't, because money, like faith, only works when people believe. Our skyscrapers rise like modern pyramids, monuments to commerce, power, and ambition. Corporations replace kingdoms. CEOs replace pharaohs. And still, millions toil, trading time and energy for paper promises that exist only because everyone agrees they do. When the markets tremble, fear spreads faster than famine. When confidence collapses, entire nations crumble. The system doesn't need chains to hold us, only belief. The same belief that once made men drag stones through the desert now makes them wake at dawn to build digital empires. The same hunger for meaning that filled the temples now fills the boardrooms. We are no longer building tombs for gods. We are building data centers for our own immortality. Digital pyramids meant to outlive us. The illusion continues. The faces have changed. But the currency of faith still rules.